Hey guys, welcome back to SideTracked. This week we're going to be doing something a little different, kind of almost an expansion on what we talked about last time with the photography in music for the album covers. But we're going to move into, instead, music's impact on a film. So we're going to talk about, for Album of the Week, we have a film soundtrack, and we're going to have some guest professors on from the university film department to come talk about what a good soundtrack adds to or brings to a movie and what makes up a good soundtrack. So without further ado, let's move into Juno.
All right, so most people have seen this movie, but just in case you haven't, Juno is about she's a junior?
She's 16.
16-year-old high school student who gets pregnant by a boy that she's not even really dating, but they have like this weird relationship going on. She ends up having the baby and giving it away, and it's like it's kind of a serious topic that I feel like a lot of high school kids have to go through. But yeah, so we're going to talk about the soundtrack that.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason that this soundtrack works so well is that Juno's character is this very expressive, rebellious, quirky person, and the soundtrack brings in a lot of anti-folk. It's done by Kimya Dawson of the Moldy Peaches, and the music itself has that that feeling to it. It is very personal. It's much more focused on the personality of the person who's performing it rather than any sort of technical precision musically. So I think that was an insanely good choice. I actually read that Jason Reitman, the director, he went and asked Ellen Page, he's like, what would Juno listen to? And Ellen Page was like, oh, she'd be listening to Moldy Peaches. And he had never heard of him, so he listened to him and got in touch with Kimya Dawson, and she was like, no, you can't use my music. And then she read the script and was like, oh, yes, you can use my music. And then she ended up not just the Moldy Peaches, but she wrote some songs for it. Her other band, what are they? Antsy Pants, her other project. Yeah, she did all kinds of stuff for her. So.
Yeah, cool. Do you have a favorite song on the album?
I mean, so the version of Anyone Else But You,
that's exactly what I was gonna
that
bring
Michael
up.
Cera and Ellen Page sing
In the song,
has
yeah.
actually kind of overshadowed the original for me, which I think is very rare for that to happen, but the way that it takes me back to watching that movie, you know? I
No,
think
definitely. And it's adorable, it's so cute. But I was gonna say, I had never listened to the Moldy Peaches before watching this movie, and I revisited them and kind of started listening to them again whenever we said that we were going to do this album. And we had been listening to, up in the newsroom, we'd been listening to the Moldy Peaches for a long time, and I think I got everyone else up there hooked on it, because that's all we listened to now, for a while anyways. We had been just listening to the Moldy Peaches, and yeah, it's kind of growing on the Mule Skinner new staff.
Yeah, I feel like all the people who follow me on Spotify, must think I'm crazy, because whenever we have a record on for the show or an artist that we talk about, it's that's all I listen to. Somebody commented to me the other day, they're like, how many times did you listen to LCD Sound System this week? And I'm like, well, I got to. So I like the way that works. I also now I'm trying to think, I'm blanking. There's a Velvet Underground song on here, and it's been forever since I've seen this movie, but gotta give a shout out to that. And the Kinks are on this thing. Mott the Hoople. There's just some solid tracks coming out of left field that I would not expect just in a movie about teen pregnancy necessarily. So
Definitely.
yeah, I think that's about all I got on Juno.
Yeah,
Let's move into a commercial break, and then when we come back, we're gonna have Eric Newsom and Michael Graves come and wax lyrical about lyrical wax.
Hey guys, welcome back to SideTracked. For this segment, we're going to be talking to Dr. Michael Graves and Dr. Eric Newsom, and we're going to be talking about music and movies.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you guys so much for coming on. We're going to open the floor, pretty general question. What makes a good soundtrack for a movie?
Well, we probably want to start by distinguishing what we mean by soundtrack versus what we mean by film score.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
And I think the idea there is that a score is something that's specifically composed for the film, whereas a soundtrack is a selection of pre-existing music and pre-existing materials. Oftentimes popular music, but not necessarily have a classical music soundtrack. And oftentimes, so the waters are a bit muddy because in a score you can bring in elements of classical music, certainly. But generally speaking, a score is made specifically for the story that the filmmakers are telling. And a soundtrack is selecting songs that existed before to supplement the story.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah, and that really kind of largely starts in the late '60s with one of the first films to do that was The Graduate, where they're incorporating previous Simon and Garfunkel songs into the soundtrack, into the movie, in a way in which the audience who was watching the film would have been familiar with the songs prior to watching the movie. And then the soundtrack had a lot of commercial success and sort of began success breeds imitation oftentimes, and so there was a lot of similar approaches after that.
So what makes a good soundtrack? Would you like to start that?
Sure. Well, I don't know. For me, it's so we're talking soundtracks.
Soundtracks, I think soundtracks.
Okay, soundtracks. Okay.
So I'll say soundtracks a bunch of times.
Soundtracks. Yes.
Soundtrack.
You know, I don't know if I could necessarily point to for me in terms of both soundtrack and score. It has to do with I don't know if I could point to like a specific quality or characteristic, but it's more about the way the soundtrack or the score works in concert with the story being told or the way in which the story is told. So I think of something like Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score for The Social Network, which is really dark and sort of disquieting, works very well. I'm a really big fan of Denis Villeneuve, a Quebecois, I like saying that word, Quebecois filmmaker, who I think he's the most exciting filmmaker working today, and he's collaborated several times with Johansson, I believe, and so for Arrival, the score is very almost otherworldly, and I think it works very well for a story about aliens and our first contact with this other species. And then there's something like my favorite film this year has been A Ghost Story. And Daniel Hart's score for that is really perfectly complements the, well, it's maybe a bad pun, but the sort of haunting poignancy of the film, the sort of a really beautiful melancholy feeling to the.
And that's an interesting one because the music in that film really has the sound has to ground the visual imagery, which runs into the danger of being almost comical at points because of, if you've not seen it, it's a man like with a sheet on. He's a ghost, but he has that traditional Halloween costume ghost look to it, and so the timbre and the tone that the music brings to the film really helps ground it to say this isn't the visual is this stark visual, but listen to it. It's this sort of feeling. And I think that's the thing that a good soundtrack does, or a good score does, but is it really depends upon the movie and the job that the filmmakers are trying to do. Because a song that's a good song can stand on its own, but you can't just take a good song and stick it with a good movie and expect it to work within that. And I don't want to say that Watchmen is a good movie, but you see this sort of just picking like the most obvious big good songs for a soundtrack in the opening sequence.
I was going to say Suicide Squad for the exact reason that it just takes popular music that fits what's being displayed on screen. And another example of a horrible movie. But
it's two on the nose.
Exactly.
Yes,
And
Zack Snyder is such an egregious offender, and that it's like music. Tell me how to feel. You know.
And so, but there are other movies where the soundtrack, because the music already exists outside of it, people are often bringing. One of the reasons to use a song from a soundtrack is to bring that feeling that people already have about this music into that moment. And one of the interesting things about soundtracks is that sometimes, because you've seen the song within the world or within the story that's being told, it's hard then to separate that song back out of it without reliving that moment of the movie. which is, so I like invite me back to talk about this, but my favorite band is the Kinks, right? But in Rushmore, there's a use of there's nothing in this world to stop me worrying about that girl. That when I hear that song now, even when I'm listening to Kinks albums straight through, takes me back to that specific moment in the movie, and I can't separate that music anymore from that emotional moment in the movie. And I think one of the reasons that soundtracks come to the fore in the 60s too is that not only because we have the rise of popular music then, but that's also when we start to see the decline of the musical. And previously we had the musical where you would have these asides, right? You have these moments where the emotions can't be physically portrayed, and so we remove them out into this weird music dancing space that breaks our expectations of, we have to suspend our disbelief, but to get into the mindset and the feelings of the characters. And once we stop making musicals, we bring in soundtracks instead, which come on, they're non-diegetic, they come on with lyrics that are being played. The characters aren't hearing these, but oftentimes they're sort of meant to represent the inner lives of the characters on screen or the emotions that they're feeling. And so the songs sort of supplement those in a way that once you've attached them to this moment for this character, it's hard to sort of pull those back again.
It's interesting. You mentioned hearing a song and having it be associated with the film, and I've sort of noticed the inverse happen when I screen The Graduate for students, and so The Sound of Silence has seemingly now like it elicits. It's a very somber, sad song, and when it plays in The Graduate, it gets laughs. And I think it's because it's been in things like Old School and sort of memes and stuff. So when people hear it,
The Trolls movie.
yeah, the Trolls movie. I'll take your word for it. But yeah, and so it's really interesting that now almost every time I screen it with an audience, it gets laughs, and it's meant to be this, the way it's used. It's a very somber.
And this is the difference between a score, which would be just for that, and a soundtrack wherein you're pulling cultural currency, right? So it has a value to it already, and you're inserting it in there. But the other also does happen in which songs from films then become, or songs from film scores become soundtracks for other things. So like.
So that being said,
the two notes of Jaws, for instance, you see that everywhere else, and it elicits.
So that being said, what are some of your guys' favorite soundtracks and or scores?
I really like the soundtrack to Boogie Nights, a Paul Thomas Anderson film that uses a collection of songs from the 70s, and I think it really kind of perfectly uses those songs to kind of capture a sense of nostalgia and I don't know, the sense of the decade. And it's interesting because there's an instance where sort of period-specific music is used on the soundtrack very, very effectively. And then more recently, Ken Burns, and he has a collaborator, and I'm blanking on her name, but they have a documentary out now on the Vietnam War. And rather than using sort of period-specific music for the documentary, they're actually use a score and sort of existing songs from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who are very sort of popular. What's the word I'm looking for? They're a really great composing duo now, and so Burns and his collaborator use scores created by Ross and Reznor, as well as pre-existing Nine Inch Nails songs, and it's a really interesting effect. I'm glad they sort of went in the opposite direction in terms of not just using sort of period 1970s music. It is a little weird though for me. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, but it is a little weird to, I grew up listening to Nine Inch Nails, and then to hear some of the elements of Nine Inch Nails songs in the Vietnam setting is a little disconcerting, or it's just a little jarring maybe. But
because the thing that you would expect there is the Forrest Gump soundtrack, because that's
exactly
sort of the inextricable link, because that, everybody saw that movie, everybody had a copy of the soundtrack, it seemed forever.
Yeah, I think it's one of the top 5 highest grossing soundtracks. So.
It would be interesting to guess at that. Dazed and Confused, Forrest Gump, The Graduate.
Nope.
None of those?
I believe it is The Bodyguard. It's number 1.
Oh, The Bodyguard.
Purple Rain is on there somewhere in the top 5. Titanic,
These-
Dirty
These
Dancing,
make a lot of sense. Yeah.
and Forrest Gump. I think that's right. Anyway.
All of those seem like they would make sense to me. My favorite soundtracks, I really like the. I already talked about a song from one of them, the soundtracks to the Wes Anderson movies. I'm really interested in the link or the connection that he has with his composers, but especially early on when Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo came in to do the score for Bottle Rocket, and it's interesting to read about this collaboration because Mark Mothersbaugh comes to him and he says, "So what do you want this to sound like? What do you?" And he said that Wes Anderson's played them all these things that had like these high tinkly noises, like on the upper register, with like these small tinny sounds. And so he went out and found as many things as he could that had that sort of baroque feel to it, and plucked things and things like that. And so you hear that through the first couple of their collaborations, which were sort of a mix of Mothersbaugh's original score for the film and the soundtracks that go through those, but certainly Bottle Rocket and Rushmore are among my favorites there. I also like a lot of really weird esoteric stuff. I really like the soundtrack for an ostensibly a James Bond film from 1967 called Casino Royale. Not the Daniel Craig version, but a film in which like 6 different actors, including Peter Sellers and Woody Allen, played versions of James Bond, sort of. And has a really solid soundtrack, but the Burt Bacharach does the score, and the songs for The Look of Love by Dusty Springfield is on that one. It's great, but just evokes this time period that I didn't live through. But I listened to that and I put in that weird sort of comedy fantasy world of the 60s. Yeah, one of the things, and here's an interesting thing where we talk about the intersection of music and movies. I'm not a big Quentin Tarantino fan, but I do think one of the places where he is successful is in his selection of songs to augment scenes. I think, I look at Steelers Wheel, is that the name of the band that Stuck in the Middle with You from Reservoir Dogs? Like that's a good scene because he's chosen the perfect song to go along with that. Things like the Kill Bill soundtrack are pulling from the movies that he's homaging in a really effective way, such that I really like the soundtracks to his films, and I could take or leave the actual films themselves.
Okay. So this is the question we talked about earlier when the cameras were off, but it was so good I want to bring it up again. Favorite original song composed for a film?
I think for me, it is Somewhere Over the Rainbow from with the Wind from Wizard of Oz. I just find it beautiful and sad, and it's just an amazing song.
It hits a nice point between beautiful and joyous and sad.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the Israel, I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, the ukulele version. Right. He also brings in Wonderful World for that. I think that's why those songs go so well together. It's both joy and it's melancholy in those songs.
There's a recording of Somewhere Over the Rainbow in which she sings it, Judy Garland sings it even in a more sort of sad take, and they didn't use it in the film, but it's really haunting.
She's living in Kansas, and what could be worse?
I'm being Dorothy for Halloween, so that's cool.
I was saying that one of my favorite original songs is Alfie for the movie Alfie, because I think that's if you've not seen, I'm talking about the original Michael Caine Alfie. At the end of that one, it's sort of the same thing. It's a mood. The mood of that song is in between moods. It's a very jazzy arrangement. The song is sung by Cher in the film, but it's a song asking the main character. He at the end of the film. I don't want to spoil the film for everybody, but at the end of the film, he's sort of left like in the middle of everything, and nothing is resolved for him. And the song is basically like, what are you doing? What is all of this? In a really powerful way. Right as the credits hit, you come in with this sort of loud, jazzy song that questions the main character of the film in a really effective way. I also, my favorite soundtracks and my favorite original songs, my favorite Disney movie is Robin Hood. And the music, the country music for that movie is so great. But the Roger Miller, Oodalali, Whistle Stop, which is the whistling song that opens it up, but especially Not in Nottingham. The sad song that they sing is they're being taxed and the rain is falling on the church. I really love that song too.
Thing I know you're a fan of showed the other day, Over the Garden
Over
Wall.
the Garden
That
Wall
has some great original music.
I've
too.
been listening to a lot of that lately, and one of the problems with Over the Garden Wall is it's hard to get all of the music that's from it. There's some bootleg copies that are floating around on the internet where you have like 100 different tracks of all the songs and all the original music and all the things that they brought into that. But yeah, I've been listening to that a lot lately too.
Well, I think that's just about all the time we blocked off for this. That was some amazing discussion. Didn't get everywhere that we meant to, but I don't even mind because what we did, I feel like we fleshed out pretty extensively. So thank you guys so much for coming on.
Sure, thanks for having us.
Thank the department for opening this space up for us to use and for allowing us to use this equipment and everything. And see y'all next time.
Thank you for waiting. We will assist you shortly.